All right, we're going to go over the osmosis and diffusion review sheet. So number 1 says that the cell membrane regulates and controls what kind of molecules move in and out of a cell. So remember, things can cross the cell membrane, but only if the cell membrane allows it. So it is in charge of regulating those molecules that can move in and out. Number 2 says when molecules spread from an area of high concentration to low concentration, it's called diffusion. So if you remember, when molecules are added to something, like if you put food coloring in water, for example, eventually those molecules will spread out evenly throughout all of the water that you added the food coloring to. That's called diffusion. Number 3 says as molecules diffuse, they create a concentration gradient, which is a difference in concentrations across the space. So again, as you add food coloring, for example, to water, when you add it to the water, at first, all of the food coloring is concentrated in a couple of drops. And so that is a high concentration area, and it will diffuse out into the rest of the water, which is a low concentration area. Number 4 says that a cell membrane or cell membranes are semi-permeable. This means that they only allow certain things to pass through. And that is indeed what happens, right? Cell membranes can control what goes in and out of the cell, and so they can prevent some things from entering or exiting the cell. If the cell just let anything pass, we'll look at number 5. It says a membrane that would allow anything to pass through would be called permeable. So if something's permeable, anything can pass through that membrane. Semi-permeable means that only some things can pass through the membrane. Number 6 says diffusion is the movement of molecules. Osmosis is the diffusion of water. So typically water can cross membranes more easily than other molecules, and so osmosis is when water moves through a membrane to change the concentration of the space either inside or outside of the membrane. Number 7 says osmosis is the process of water molecules moving across the membrane. So diffusion occurs without a membrane. Osmosis occurs when water moves through a membrane. Number 8, the direction that water molecules move is determined by the difference in the concentration of solute dissolved in the solvent inside and outside of the cell. So remember, anytime you make a solution, it has to be made up of 2 components, the solvent and the solute. So an example would be if you were to dissolve salt in water, water is the solvent and salt is the solute because it dissolves in the water. Number 9, osmotic pressure or osmosis pushes water molecules towards the area of greater solute concentration. So water goes towards high concentration areas so that it can dilute those areas. Number 10 says water molecules are pulled away from areas of lower solute concentration. So the goal of diffusion is always to reach equilibrium so that it's equal throughout a space, or so that a solute is distributed equally. And so water will be pulled away from areas of low concentration or move towards areas of high concentration. Number 11. The word hypertonic means high concentration of solutes. So when you have a hypertonic solution, it means there is a high concentration of solutes or a lot of dissolved solutes in that solution. Number 12, the word hypotonic means low concentration of solutes. So if you have a dilute solution that has a very small number of dissolved solutes, that means that it's a hypotonic solution typically. Number 13, a plant cell undergoes plasmolysis, or shrinking of the cell membrane, when it is placed in a solution with a high concentration of solute. What type of solution causes plasmolysis? And these are hypertonic solutions. When something has a high concentration of solute and draws water out of a cell to cause it to shrink, that happens when a cell is in a hypertonic solution. So remember, that means that the solution outside of the cell has more dissolved solutes than the solution inside of the cell. Number 14, an animal cell undergoes cytolysis, or stretching of the cell membrane when it's placed in a solution with a very low concentration of solute. What type of solution causes cytolysis? And those are hypotonic solutions. Hypotonic solutions have a very low amount of dissolved solute relative to the cell, which means that water rushes into the cell and causes the cell to expand or swell, and sometimes the cell can even burst. Number 15. Turgor pressure is the flow of water into a plant cell that causes the cell membrane to be pushed up against the cell wall and causes the sac in a plant cell to expand. What is the sac that holds this water from the turgor pressure? So if you remember from our cell parts unit, a vacuole stores water and other things inside of a plant cell. So when the vacuole inside of a plant cell is filled with water, it causes the cell to become even more rigid, and that's called turgor pressure. Next, we're going to talk about the different ionic solutions. So remember, there's isotonic, hypotonic, and hypertonic solutions. And so we'll talk about each of those three types over the next several questions. We'll start with isotonic solutions. So number 16 says, the concentration of the solutes inside the cell is blank to the concentration outside the cell. So if you're talking about an isotonic solution, the answer is C, and that is equal to the concentration. So if you have an isotonic solution, you'll notice that the concentration of solutes is the same outside the cell and inside the cell. So like in the example that I just drew, there's a 10% salt solution outside the cell and 10% inside the cell. So that's isotonic because they are equal. Number 17, water will move, and then the answer is C, in and out of the cell at the same rate. A cell that is in an isotonic solution neither shrinks nor swells because the water can move in and out of the cell at the same rate. Number 18, turgor pressure is the pressure that water places on the inside of a plant cell. An increase in turgor pressure can cause the cell membrane to press up against the cell wall, and a decrease in turgor pressure can cause the cell membrane to shrivel. If the turgor pressure is kept constant, the cell membrane will maintain its shape. In an isotonic solution, the turgor pressure is A, normal, meaning that the cell maintains its shape and does not shrink or swell because water is moving in and out of the cell at the same rate. We have two more questions about isotonic solutions on this page, and then we'll move on to hypotonic and hypertonic solutions. Number 19. In animal cells, the cell membrane will be normal, and that is because water is moving in an isotonic solution in the same or at the same rate both in and out of the cell, and so the cell membrane will not change shape or size. Number 20. In the picture to the right, the movement of water across the membrane will be C, in and out equally. And again, because the cell is in an isotonic solution, it means that the water is going to move in and out of the cell at the same rate, and it means that the cell will not shrink nor swell. Now we're going to move on to hypotonic solutions. So number 21 says the concentration of the solutes inside the cell is blank to the concentration outside the cell. And in a hypotonic solution, that is B, greater than the concentration outside the cell. So in a hypotonic solution, there's more dissolved solute outside of the cell than there is inside of the cell. Number 22. Water molecules will move A, into the cell faster than they will move out of the cell. And that's because, again, there's lower concentration outside of the cell than there is inside of the cell, which means that the water outside of the cell will tend to rush into the cell and cause it to swell. Number 23. Turgor pressure is the pressure that water places on the inside of a plant cell. An increase in turgor pressure can cause the cell membrane to press up against the cell wall, and a decrease in turgor pressure can cause the cell membrane to shrivel. If the turgor pressure is kept constant, the cell membrane will maintain its shape. In a hypotonic solution, the turgor pressure is increasing, and this is because water is rushing into the plant cell, so it puts more pressure on the cell membrane from the inside. Number 24. In animal cells, the cell membrane will C, expand and possibly burst. And again, this is because water is rushing into the cell, and there's no cell wall to help the cell membrane stop from bursting, and so animal cells can actually burst if they are in a hypotonic solution. Number 25. In the picture to the right, the movement of water across the membrane will be B, mostly into the cell. And again, this is because that low concentration of water outside of the cell and the high concentration inside of the cell causes water to be pulled into the cell and cause it to swell. Finally, we'll talk about hypertonic solutions. So number 26 says the concentration of the solutes inside of the cell is A, less than the concentration outside of the cell. And so when you have a hypertonic solution, you have a very high concentration outside of the cell and a low concentration inside of the cell. Number 27. Water molecules will move B, out of the cell faster than they will move into the cell. And again, this is because the concentration outside of the cell is higher, so it will pull water out of the cell. Number 28. Turgor pressure is the pressure that water places on the inside of a plant cell. An increase in turgor pressure can cause the cell membrane to press up against the cell wall, and a decrease in turgor pressure can cause the cell membrane to shrivel. If the turgor pressure is kept constant, the cell membrane will maintain its shape. In a hypertonic solution, the turgor pressure is decreasing, and this is because water is leaving the cell, and so it causes the cell membrane to pull away from the cell wall, and it will shrink the cell inside of the cell wall. Number 29. In animal cells, the cell membrane will shrivel up, and so animal cells in hypertonic solutions shrink because they lose water. And lastly, 30 says in the picture to the right, the movement of water across the membrane will be, and that is A, mostly out. Because there is a 30% salt solution outside of the cell and a 10% salt solution inside of the cell, water will be pulled out of the cell towards that 30% salt solution.